How's everyone doing tonight? So today we are going to be going over chapter 2 of our Visual Basic book. Chapter 2 focuses primarily on program and GUI design. So I think most of you are going to have a lot of fun in this chapter, especially those of you that are more creative or artistic types. Designing GUIs it's fun. It's a lot of fun for a lot of people. For myself in my career, I was never a real creative, artistic type person. I like doing coding and things like that rather than GUI design. I could do it, but it just wasn't one of my strong suits. If we were doing a GUI type application, we would usually hire a UX designer that would help us out making a pretty UI. It just wasn't our thing. We were more technical type people in my company. But some of you will be very, very good at it. And I can, even though GUI is not like something I focused on in my career, I can still identify a good GUI and critique yours. So that's what we're going to be focusing on mostly in this chapter, getting familiar with the Visual Studio UI and some of the tools that you'll be using to build user interfaces. Oops, let me click on this. So our objectives for today are going to be to create a Visual Basic 2017 Windows desktop application project. All the projects we'll be doing in this chapter are Windows desktop applications. So they can't run on Macs, they can't run anywhere else, they're just Windows applications. Now, that's a bit limiting, but most companies use primarily for their end user PCs are still using Windows applications. So if you're in a shop that's mostly Windows, developing something in VB is going to be fine. We're going to work on becoming familiar with the Visual Studio 2017 Integrated Development Environment, or IDE, as we refer to it. Each chapter in this book, we're going to introduce to you a couple of new objects. So in this chapter, the Windows Form object, a Windows Form object is basically, in an application, a screen. We'll be introducing label objects. Label objects are used for titles, or think about a screen where you're entering your name and address. Next to each box where you're entering the name is a label that tells you this is your first name, this is your last name. That's a label, just you're labeling another object. If you want to put a picture in your application, you have to put that picture in what's called a picture box, or an image, a GIF file, a JPEG. You can't just slap the image onto the screen. It has to live inside a VB object called a picture box object. And we also have button objects, so a save button, a close button, something like that. As we get into designing nice GUIs or nice user interfaces, Visual Studio has a lot of tools that will allow us to build those interfaces. So tools to allow us to align objects, center objects. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those things, and we'll talk even more about it when I'm going to do a separate video after this one, where I'll go through actually with you step by step in Visual Studio designing the interface. And with this one, I'm just going to be doing the presentation, talking about things to get you familiar with it. And then the next video I do will be me actually going through the guided program development with you. So we'll talk about saving, closing, and reopening visual projects after you've created them. And we'll talk about some really basic design principles or good UI, UX, graphical user interface design. We'll start to talk about the first two phases of the program development lifecycle, or the software development lifecycle. That's something we'll be talking about a lot this year. As we get further in to the year, we'll get through some of the more advanced phases of that cycle. And we'll dig into that a little bit, just so you understand what it is. So before a program can be coded using Visual Basic, you have to design it. So someone at some point is going to give you requirements, or you're going to talk to someone, they're going to tell you you need something. Sometimes requirements are something really simple, like someone scribbles something on a napkin in a cafeteria for you. Sometimes you get a real formal document. Sometimes you just talk to your end users and they just talk to you about what they're looking for. So the process of translating those requirements into a user interface is program design. The guided program development application that you're going to be developing, it's a very, very simple application. Think of it as part of a larger application. It's a small little piece of a larger application. So it's going to be a coffee latte order. So you're selecting either a latte or coffee or a mocha in this two pictures that you're displaying back and forth. So a little application for a coffee shop. So the program begins by displaying the latte selection window, which looks like this. So we've got a couple things here. We've got our form. This is our form or our screen. We've got a label here, so kind of a title of the screen. We also have a title in the title bar. We've got a couple buttons, and the buttons look a little different, and we'll talk about that later on. Got another label here, and we've got an exit button down there. So just a couple different objects, some of the objects we've talked about. So in this application, if the user clicks the pumpkin spice button, a picture of pumpkin spice latte is displayed. So the user will come over, click pumpkin spice. Initially, there'll be no images displayed. When they click this pumpkin spice button, the image will appear. So that image is originally hidden. If the user comes over and clicks the mocha button, the pumpkin button gets hidden and the mocha image gets displayed. And then after the user, so the user can toggle back and forth between mocha and pumpkin spice. And when they're done, they hit the select latte button. And then the message that was here in the previous screen, I'll show you the message that says choose a latte flavor. When they hit select, that label disappears and you see another label that says enjoy your latte selection, and then you can exit the application. So that's basically what the finished application will do. In this chapter, we're not going to be doing any of the coding to hide and display things. We're just going to focus on good GUI design and learning about the interface. So we're going to start pretty slow, but we'll get cranking up pretty fast. I don't want to bore you with this stuff. So don't worry if you're getting a little bored, it seems a little simplistic. It will get more complex as we go along. So when designing an event-driven program that uses a graphical user interface, such as a program in this chapter, one of the first steps after defining the purpose of the program is to design the user interface yourself. So before starting this design, you're going to want to learn how to use some of the tools that Visual Studio and Visual Basic provide. And those are considered RAD tools, or Rapid Application Development Tools. So in some programming languages, if you want to put a button on the screen, you have to write 20 lines of code. In Visual Basic and C# and some other Microsoft-based languages, all you have to do is click a button off a toolbar and drag it on your screen, and it writes all the code for you. So it makes it a lot faster, and clients and people you're working for appreciate that because that saves them money. So a project within Visual Studio is equivalent to a single program created. Okay, so a Windows Classic desktop project is a program that includes a user interface with windows are created using the Windows operating system. So you have a project, and that project can have one form or it can have multiple forms. When the program is executed, the user interacts with the program using its Windows and Windows components, the user interface. So you're clicking the buttons, or later on we'll have drop downs, later on we'll have text boxes, different objects that you'll be using. This is what your IDE is going to look like when you start it up. And it's very customizable, and you'll get very familiar with it as we go along. So we've got a couple things. We've got the work area here. There's a toolbox button where you're going to display your toolbox. We'll talk about that later on too. Some of these things are going to make more sense when I do the the guided program walkthrough because I'll show you within Visual Studio how to do all these things. So bear with me here. We'll just kind of start talking about some of the terminology, and then we'll get into it later on. The Visual Studio window contains several important features you should know. First, portion of the window known as the work area. That's a tab page named Form 1. It contains a Windows Form object. The Windows Form object is a window you use to build the program and then display it on your screen when you execute the program. So when you start Visual Studio, it's going to start you off with a form, a basic form. It's going to be blank. There's going to be nothing in it, and it's going to be called Form 1. So that's where you're going to start your design. And it's going to look something like this. It's going to look actually something like this. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get your toolbox set up so you can start putting objects on there. Okay, so you're going to click here. This is going to show, this is all your tools. This is where your buttons and your labels are going to be. And you'll be able to click on these and drag them onto your form. Before you do that, what you need to do though is pin your toolbox to your screen. So once you pin your toolbox to your screen, it's going to change the size of the work area. So put your form right in the middle there. So you're going to click this little pin, and that'll pin that toolbox for you. And that's going to permanently pin it there. The other thing we have are properties, object properties. So all the objects, buttons, forms, picture boxes have properties. Properties describe a multitude of characteristics about the object. Its color, its size, its name, the position on the screen, anything about that object. And different objects will have different properties. And the properties window is usually on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And you can sort the properties alphabetically in different ways, however it makes it easier for you to find those different properties. Some of the objects have 30 or 40 different properties, so there's a lot of stuff in there that you'll never use. We'll probably be dealing with 3 or 4 different properties initially of each object. So this is what your property windows look like. So over in the form here, I would click on a button. It looks like on this one, they clicked on the form. So the form has properties. Then you see all the different things. So this is a background color. There's all kinds of different properties that you can change to customize the look and feel of the application. One thing that I'm going to be really focused on for you guys is naming conventions. So what a naming convention is it's a name that you give to all your objects. So if you put a label on the screen, or a picture box on the screen, or a button on the screen, by default, the first button you put on the screen is going to be called button 1. The second button on the screen is going to be called button 2. Now that's fine if you have just 1 or 2 buttons, but as you get more and more buttons, when you start coding it, you're not going to remember that button 1 was for save and button 2 was for close. So what we do is you give those objects descriptive names, so it's easy for you as a developer, okay? So each type of object has a specific naming convention. Names are typed in camel case, and we don't use spaces in any of our object names. The first 3 letters of your object, of your naming convention, are the lowercase abbreviated object type. So for a form, if you're doing a naming convention for a form, you're going to start with lowercase FRM. And so this one is just called my application. But for the latte selection, you might call it latte selection. For your buttons, you're going to start it with BTN. And if it's a save, it's BTN, lowercase BTN, and then capital SAVE. So button save. And this is the name. So the name property on the objects, this is what you're changing. You're changing this naming convention. Picture boxes are PIC and labels are LBL. So it's kind of tedious when you have an application, you've got a lot of labels to do all this, but believe me, it's going to save you time and headaches to name these objects. And this is something I'm going to be grading you on. When I look at somebody's code, whether it's my student or someone I'm working for, I expect naming conventions. Now you may go to work at some place and they may use different naming convention than than I'm using, or different companies have their own naming conventions, and that's fine. If you're developing at a company, you want to go with what they use. But this is the naming convention that I'm using, so I'm expecting you to use these naming conventions for your applications, and it'll become second nature to you as we go along. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you start a project is rename your form. So even over here in your Solution Explorer, this is the other section of your work area that you're going to be dealing with. So we have our main work area here, our toolbar will be over here, properties window is below, and then we have our Solutions Explorer. This is where all your forms will be listed. So you'll have your project, piece of selecting. This one's called piece of selection. And then if you had multiple forms, there'd be different forms here. So what you do is you right click on this and you rename this form to whatever you want to call it. So FRM latte selection or whatever it may be. So the form object has a name property and also has a text property. The text property of your form is what gets displayed in the title bar, okay? So you want to, sometimes students have a little bit of problem distinguishing between the name property and the text property. It'll come to you after a little while. But if we look at this right here, the name property isn't displayed anywhere on the form. This right here is a default Form 1, and that's your name property. So if you see Form 1 on here on your form, that means you haven't changed the text property of your form. Okay? So the text property right here, we change that to latte selection, and then it changes the name of the form in the title bar. So we can resize our forms. There's a couple ways to do that. You'll notice on your forms, there's little handles down here. You can click on those handles and drag them, and that'll change the size of the form. So sometimes our forms will have a lot of objects in there. We need a lot of room. You can also change the size by changing the X and Y values. So this is, I guess this is in pixels. So you can play with these numbers, changing them. So this is the X value this way and the Y value. So if you want to be real specific about a size and you have different forms and you want them all the same size and you don't want to just eyeball it, you can make any object exact by using the property there. So they're doing that by X value of 730 by 700. But you can just click and drag it as well. So once we've got our form resized and we've got our text property on there, we drag and drop a label onto our form. Okay, so what you would do is you would come over here, click on the label, click and drag, put it on the form. Then we have our label object on there. If you put an object on your form and you want to get rid of it, you just select that object. Like if you wanted to delete the label, hit the delete key on your keyboard, that's going to delete it. You can undo any delete by tapping and clicking undo on your standard toolbar. Same goes for the picture box object. So click on the picture box in your toolbar, drag it over. It has sizing handles just like the form, so you can make a different size. You can use a property to resize it. We're not going to be putting any pictures in our picture boxes just yet. We're just going to be getting them ready for the next chapter when we add code. So once you put the picture box in the form, you're going to want to name it using the naming convention, starting with PIC. So if I'm putting our two picture boxes in the guided program development are pumpkin spice latte and mocha latte. So I might name one pick pumpkin spice and pick mocha. Just descriptive names of what they are. So I know later on when I start coding them, it'll make it easier to remember that one is not pick box one and pick picture box two. It's a descriptive name. So you can resize picture box objects just like everything else. Different ways of doing it, clicking the handles, changing the values down here in the properties window. We'll get into this later on in the program, walk through in more detail. When when you add multiple picture box objects, there's some additional tools that will help you with GUI design. So under the Tools menu, actually it's under the Format menu. If you select two objects at the same time, you can click on Format and make the same size, and that'll make the two objects the exact same size. So if you have two, your latte selection, your pumpkin spice, and your mocha, you're going to want those to look exactly alike for good GUI design. So this tool will allow you to make those exactly the same size. One's a little larger or smaller than the other one, it's going to look a little wonky. You don't want that. Same as make same size, there's another tool under the Format menu for aligning two objects. So we can make sure our objects are the same size and they're exactly lined up. So if one's slightly lower or higher, that's not going to make our GUI look too good. So we want everything to be lined up. And same thing with center. So we can use that Format menu to center our objects on our form horizontally or vertically, however you want. And I'll get into this a little more when we go through the guided program development. We have button objects, those work the same, size, text value. The text value is what actually displays inside the button. So if this was a save button, we would call it BTN save, and then we would change the text value to save what we want to display in the button. Change the button size. This will all be very intuitive once you get in there. And you can align buttons, and just like you align other objects, any objects these tools work with. You can align vertically, you can center them. So after you've got your program created, you want to make sure you save it. So when you create your first project, before you even start, it's going to prompt you for a name. And I'll go through this with the guided program walkthrough, but you're going to want to make sure you save it on your flash drive. And then when you save, you have to be careful how you're saving things in Visual Studio, because you have a solution, a project, and then forms. So there's multiple things that you have to worry about. And if you're not careful, you can save those things in multiple places. So you could potentially save your solution on your hard drive, but your forms on your flash drive. And you might not even know you have a problem there until you actually try to bring your flash drive into school and work on things, and then it'll say something's missing. I can't find the forms for the solution, or the solution is not attached to the forms. So when you're saving, you always want to hit Save All, okay? So that'll be File, Save All, and that'll save all the objects all together. Okay, and usually you're going to make that mistake once and you won't make it again. And once you've saved, you can close Visual Studio. File close, that'll just close out of the application. Once you've saved a project or a solution, you're going to want to reopen it. So there's 3 different ways of opening a solution you've already created. One is to go to the folder where it's stored and double-clicking the solution file. So go to File Explorer, search for where your solution file is. It's going to be the file with the SLN extension. Double-click on that. It'll open Visual Studio, and it'll open the project for you. The second method is open Visual Studio first, then go to the File, Open in the standard toolbar, locate the solution file and open it that way. And the third method is if you're using your laptop that you've created the solution in, you can go to recent projects and it'll list all of recent things that you've worked on, and you can open it that way. If you're bringing stuff back and forth between home and school, you won't be able to use that method, but opening it should be pretty simple. With most Windows programs, there's going to be multiple ways of doing things, so pretty standard stuff. So we talked a little bit about the program development lifecycle. There's many steps to it. This is just kind of a standard methodology that companies use to design programs. So it's just a set of phases and steps that developers follow to design, create, and maintain computer programs. So step one is to gather and analyze program requirements. So one of the things that I'm going to be grading you on is your ability to interpret program requirements. So you're giving a specification of what the program should do. When I look at the program, I want to make sure all the requirements are in there. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at in this chapter. The next thing is good GUI design. Okay, and that's something that some of you will be really good at, like I said before, and some of you, it may be a struggle for you, and that's fine. You know, the people that aren't really good at GUI design are probably going to be great coders, and vice versa. So don't worry too much if your GUIs are ugly. My GUIs are usually pretty ugly too. So don't worry too much about that. So those are going to be the first those two first phases: gather and design the user interface. That's what we're going to be covering in this chapter. Later on, we'll get into designing the program processing objects, coding, testing, documenting the program, and maintaining the program. So those are all the steps for the program development lifecycle. Sometimes they call it the system development lifecycle, or SDLC. So gathering program requirements. So there's different ways that you'll gather program requirements. Sometimes you're interviewing users. Sometimes someone will just give you requirements. There's two types of requirements documentation that you'll get in this book. There's a requirements document, which is very detailed, and then a use case definition. Use cases are usually created by end users. So this is part of the Scrum Scrum methodology of developing applications. So what you do in that case, if you're doing things using Scrum, your users will come up with requirements for you, and they create a use case or a user story, how they want this application to work, and then the developers interpret it that way. So use cases tend to be less detailed than a requirements document. And some of the requirements you get in this book are use cases. So you just have to be more creative and ask more questions about it. So those would be kind of the 3-dot programs in this book, the more complicated ones, where you might have to ask me questions or read into the requirements a little more. Developers sometimes spend 25 to 40% of program design on the user interface. I never spent that much time on the user interface, but I would rather code than design a user interface. User interfaces are also called the presentation layer. You're going to use Visual Studio to create the user interface. And sometimes we call our user interface designs mock-ups. So a lot of times before we give the user a finished GUI with all the code behind it, you might want to show them what the screen looks like before you start coding it. Because the last thing you want to do is spend 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 months designing something, coding it, and then you give it to your user and they say, oh, that's not what I was looking for. And that happens quite a bit. And you should do that with me when you're in shop as well. If you're working on something and you're not sure exactly if this is what we're looking for, call me over or send me an email and say, can we jump on a Zoom, not a Zoom, a Google Meet, just so you can look at my screen and see if this is what I should be doing. Good idea to do that before you get too far. So some principles of good user interface design. Your user interface should be easy to use and follow. Users will not be satisfied with the application if the user interface is not easy to use. So if you get a bad GUI, your users aren't going to use it. That's just basic common sense. 4 primary means of interacting with the user interface are keyboard, pointing device, a mouse, touch interface, and voice input. Voice input's big now. Everyone has an Alexa or a Google device. So those are big. We're not going to have any of that functionality. Although Windows has Cortana, so it would be cool to see if we can get our applications, our Windows applications working Cortana. Although I don't think anyone uses Cortana. Your user interface should feel natural and normal and provide the most appropriate object for each requirement. So that means for instance, if you're asking a user to enter the state? Do you want them to type in the state name every time, Massachusetts? They might spell it wrong. So what do you do instead of putting a text box in and having them type in state? You provide a drop down with all the states' names listed, and they just drop down and select, and it's in alphabetical order they can scroll through. So that's making it easy for your end users. Once an object is used for a particular requirement, then that object should be used for the same requirement throughout the program interface. Objects must be arranged in a sequence in which they are used. One thing I've seen that's really bad user interface is if you have an application with multiple forms. At the bottom of the form, you might have a close button. Make sure that close button is in the same place in every form. You don't want it in one form to be on the right side and on the other form to be on the left side. That's going to be very confusing for the users, and they're going to, keep things in the same place. Make the application intuitive. Interface should be kept as simple as possible while containing all required functionality. User interface should be intuitive. And I think most important is think about your audience. So who's going to be using this application? If you're developing an application for elementary school students, that user interface is going to look much different than an application you're developing for someone in a business. An application for elementary school students is going to have bright colors. The letters are going to be big. It's probably going to have a lot of pictures and images. It's going to look happy. An application for a business is going to maybe look a little more stuffy. It's going to look professional. It's going to have small letters. It's going to have a lot of information packed in it. You're not going to want to use bright colors or a lot of pictures. It's going to be simple so they can get in and out of there fast. So you're going to want to think about that when you're designing your applications. So the guided program walkthrough, this is what your final project program is going to look like when it's done. Excuse me. So you're going to have a label, 2 picture boxes, nothing in the picture boxes, 3 buttons, pumpkin spice, mocha, and select latte, a few labels, and an exit button. Pretty simple stuff, and you'll notice that everything here is centered. If I had to critique this user interface, one thing I wouldn't like is the space here, and the space here is the same, but there's a larger space in the middle. So I might move these two closer together so the space here, here, and here is the same. Just a little critique. Not a huge deal, but if I had to say one thing about it, that would be my complaint. So this is it for the presentation. You've completed all this. When you've done this, you've completed all the steps to create the GUI mockup for the latte selection program. Many of the steps that we've gone through, or you will go through, are somewhat repetitive. You're going to kind of do the same thing on all the applications, but it's practice. It's getting you used to building these applications. And when you master these techniques and some of the other principles of user interface design, you're going to be able to design interfaces for all the programs. We're going to start simple, but we will get a lot more complicated as we go along. So stay tuned. I will be posting a video for the guided program walkthrough shortly.